Hey everybody, I'm Tanner Knight, and today we are going to be talking about Peavey. Now, if you've ever spent any time watching this channel, you'll probably see a few Peavey videos show up in the feed. Peavey is one of my favorite brands for a couple different reasons. Number one, they started out as a manufacturer of instruments right here in the United States. So it's a homegrown USA musical instrument manufacturer, and it competes pretty head-to-head with the likes of Fender, Gibson, and other large household names. But the thing that I love about Peavey is that their whole focus from the start was producing lower cost, higher quality musical instruments. And from the early days when Hartley Peavey was just a young guy on his own making amps in his basement or wherever, he really developed an eye for quality and wanted to make sure that his lower cost instruments compared to the other companies were higher quality than what you could buy. So this is not a complete comprehensive history of Peavey. What I aim to do in this video is talk about all of the Peavey gear that I've owned throughout the years and tie that to different eras in Peavey's history, because as I look back on all of the gear that I have owned and do currently own, it really paints a pretty good picture of where the company was at those various points. So if you do want a comprehensive history of the brand Peavey, let me know and I can spend some time working that up. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about my history with Peavey as a player, a collector, and just an overall drooler over musical instruments. So I guess the elephant in the room with Peavey is that its modern day reputation isn't that great. And there's a couple different reasons for that, which we won't go too deeply into. We're not here to discuss that. But there was an Undercover Boss, I believe that was a CBS series that aired in the mid-2000s. And Peavey was chosen to be on Undercover Boss, and it went so horribly that I'm pretty sure they pulled the entire episode. It's kind of a black mark on Peavey in the 2000s era, and there's some other subsequent controversies involving Peavey and their move away from United States production into overseas production, but that shouldn't diminish the quality of their original reputation and the original amps and instruments that they produced in the 70s and 80s. So to get us started, I'm going to go way back to 1973. This is one of the very first amplifiers that Peavey produced for guitar. Hartley Peavey, the man Peavey, his very first patent was a germanium solid-state amp circuit that he developed, and when it actually went into production, they switched from germanium to silicon because it's just much cheaper to produce silicon chips and whatnot, and the solid-state amps ran on those types of transistors. But one of the more successful products that Peavey created before they get into the whole amp and guitar realm is a PA system. And the PA system was also built on solid-state technology, and it just outsold everything in its price point because it was portable, number one, which was just unheard of at the time, and it was high quality, it was loud, and it was bomb-proof. So these are things that working musicians really value, and Peavey was there. Peavey was trying to make that happen, and the PA was one of the very early successes of the Peavey company. So that takes us to 1973, where I encounter my very first or my earliest Peavey equipment. I had a 2x12 Peavey Classic, and this was before they really had good model designations. This amp was just called the Classic, not a Classic 50, Classic 30, blah, blah, blah. It was none of that. It was just the Peavey Classic, and it was a 50-watt tube-powered amp. It did have a solid-state preamp and rectifier, so there's a hybrid technology going on even in this early 1973 amplifier. But the solid-state preamp produced a really, really unique sound, very clean, very high headroom, and by putting a couple 6L6s in the power section, it was able to take that preamp sound and produce it in the 212 speaker format. This is a combo amplifier, so it's really designed for movability, but I can tell you it's heavy. It is heavy as hell, especially if you put nicer upgraded speakers. I believe the speakers that came in this amp are unbranded Eminence speakers at this era, and they're not great. They kind of have a reputation for blowing pretty early, and then you replace them with something nice like a Celestion or an upgraded, nicer Eminence speaker. The Peavey Classic line of amps still persists to this day, And I don't think it's ever gone out of production, but the model did change from that solid state preamp to a full tube preamp later on. And I think the modern classic 50s have a full tube situation. So when I had this amp, I couldn't help shaking that it was trying to mimic or achieve the sounds of like a Fender Deluxe or a Deluxe reverb, something like that. My amp actually did have a reverb tank built in, one of those spring reverb tanks. Very nice sounding reverb, but kind of a noisy thing moving it around because it actually had a metal piece inside that made that spring reverb. But it's a really, really cool amp, Fender-y, but still Peavey flavored, and just a really nice early solid state tube hybrid piece of equipment. So that's where Peavey's heart was in the late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s. He was an amp builder. He was actually a rock star, or wanted to be a rock star in his locale in Mississippi, and he played in bands all the time. And all of the bands that he played in played his own hand-built amplifiers. So that's pretty nice, a nice luxury to have kind of an amp genius in your band providing you with that hardware. But just because he was in the amp realm didn't mean that he didn't have love for guitars and guitar design. And I read somewhere recently that he actually drew guitars in his notebooks just for fun, kind of compulsively. So he had some guitar sketch ideas from way back. And by the mid 70s, once their amplifiers, their guitar amplifiers that is, started taking off and really being the stalwart of the country scene first and foremost, and then later on rock. But they took the country scene by storm, and everybody who was anybody was playing a Peavey amplifier. And he said, okay, I see an opening in the market. Guitars have gone down in quality. This is probably 76, 77 at this point, 1976, 77, when the Japanese lawsuit guitars are starting to eat the lunch of Gibson, Fender, Gretsch, etc. So all of these US manufacturers of instruments are cutting corners, trying to cut costs, and the quality of their instruments is kind of at an all-time low at the mid to late 70s. So Peavey says, well, what the hell's going on? This shouldn't be that difficult. So he takes his guitar designs and he comes up with the T series, which is really iconic in its own right. And this is the earliest Peavey guitar that I've ever owned. I believe it's actually a 1980, but these guitars started showing up in 1978 and 79, and they have just a really rock solid reputation for being great, great guitars. So the T60 is now considered a country classic as far as guitars go. This guitar had a really, really unique circuitry for its time, and actually even for today, I would still say it's pretty unique. It came with two humbucker pickups, but they weren't your typical Gibson-esque humbucker. When you had the volume turned all the way to 10, it actually split those into single coils, or did some circuitry to get rid of one of the coils in the humbucking circuit, and it's a single coil sound, just really clean, really glassy. But when you turn that volume dial down to 7, it engages the humbuckers and gives you more of a sweet, fuller sound, what you would associate more with humbucking pickups. So there's just interesting circuitry in the knob, in the pickups, all over this guitar, very unique. And one thing I haven't even mentioned is the fact that this is the very first production guitar in the history of guitars to be manufactured using CNC, computer numerically controlled software, basically, to program a machine and cut the neck profile. Or I believe they actually used CNC to hog out the body as well, and then they were finished by hand. So the CNC machine becomes really important to Peavey in that they can produce more instruments this way, have better quality, and it's just a unique feature that they can claim at this point. Eventually, everybody starts using CNC machines to start their necks or even finish them in some cases, but this was really unheard of at the time. So Peavey was on the cutting edge of manufacturing techniques, and they really rode that wave through the 70s and 80s. So anyway, back to the T series. This is the T60 that I'm describing to you now. This is kind of the flagship model. It's their heaviest guitar. It's probably 10 pounds at the lightest, 11, 12 pounds. They're just boat anchors because they're made of swamp ash, which is notoriously heavy as a wood. They're kind of thick in the body. They're not real thin waif-like guitars. They're substantial. But we also have that hard rock maple bi-laminate neck. And that's kind of a mouthful. What does that mean? Well, it just means it's maple, or US maple. And they take two strips or one strip and they cut it in half and they swap the direction so that it makes a very, very strong bind when you glue them together. And that becomes the neck, and then they CNC the actual neck profile and finish it by hand. So the hard rock bi-laminate maple neck is a feature specific to Peavey, and I haven't seen any other manufacturer actually try to use this method moving forward, so maybe it's patented. I don't know. I do know that it makes for one hell of a strong neck though. It's very rare to find a Peavey with a twisted neck or even a broken neck. They're just very, very resilient. So the fretboard on these is usually maple, but sometimes you'll find a rosewood fretboard on the T60. That's pretty much the case for all of the T-Series guitar. We do have a rosewood premium option. I don't know how premium it is compared to the maple, but I do think that the maple looks better. That's just my personal preference. So the T60 also has a 25.5-inch scale length, so it's much closer to your Fender scale length. It's not your Gibson 24 3/4, it's 25.5. These guitars have 21 frets, which I don't know why that was chosen. I think probably just out of necessity at the time based on how the neck fit into the body, but 21 frets. They're not real high, noodly kind of guitars. They're built for country, for rhythm, for hard rock, and they're kind of chunky. The T-Series of Peavey's guitars was discontinued in 1988, so that's about 10 years that they were produced, 78 to 88, and you can find used examples anywhere in between for probably about $750 to $1,000 these days. In addition to the T40, the flagship model, we also do get a T20, which is a bass, T25, a T30, a T45, which is a bass as well, and a T26 and a T27 variant. So all of those are made in this era, and there's one more which we'll talk about, but that takes us into the 1980s. Okay, we're going to continue this video series in a couple different parts. I'm going to try to break things up by decade and see how that works. So we're going to cap this video at the end of the 1970s with all of the gear that I've owned from Peavey that was originated in the 1970s. And in the next video, we'll pick up with the 80s, which there's a significant chunk of gear there. So prepare yourself. And then we'll continue with the 90s and maybe tack the 2000s in that one video and just make it 3 parts. But either way, stay tuned and let me know if you have any questions. If you do, I will be glad to answer them in the comments. So feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.